Okay, well, we're going to begin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Ritchie, Director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Irvine, and I'd like to welcome you to our symposium on leveraging mobility innovations to address community needs. We're delighted that you could join us and excited to be offering the symposium in an online format and making it available to potentially so many more attendees. This is actually the fourth symposium in a very successful series related to innovative mobility that my ITS Irvine and Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy colleague, Sarah Katz, and I have organized in recent years, of course, with the help of many others. One of our original goals was to provide a forum in which students from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds could come together to learn about cutting-edge mobility issues, not just from leaders in the field, but also from each other and through sharing of disciplinary perspectives. And this is still true today, and that's one of the things we hope to achieve today. So while today's symposium is organized by ITS Irvine, I would like to note and thank our several co-sponsors. And these include the University of California ITS Statewide Transportation Research Program, led by the 4 ITS branches, of course, at Berkeley, Davis, Irvine, and UCLA, and funded by California Senate Bill 1. Also, the US DOT Pacific Southwest Region University Transportation Center, which was founded in 2016 as a consortium of 8 academic partners covering 4 diverse states and the Pacific Island territories, and also a new ITS Irvine National Science Foundation planning grant on smart and connected communities, led by my colleague, Professor Mike Hyland, who we'll hear from later as well. So we're all here today, not just because we have an important and timely topic, but because we're fortunate to have 3 truly amazing speakers who are each both California and national transportation leaders. They and their organizations face the challenges of our symposium topic on a daily basis, and they're here with us now online. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome, in alphabetical order, Komi Ajisi, Executive Director of Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG, Hassan Ikrata, Chief Executive Officer, San Diego Association of Governments, SANDAG, and Joshua Shank, Chief Innovation Officer, Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, LA Metro. So without further ado, thank you for your attention during these brief opening remarks, and I'll now pass control to my colleague, Sarah Katz, who's going to act as our symposium moderator. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. I am so excited about today's program. We have 3 preeminent experts in transportation and infrastructure. And while I know you're all suffering from Zoom fatigue, as Steve mentioned, it's enabled many people to join us today from all over the nation. So it's really quite beneficial today. We have representatives from, as Steve mentioned, the ITS system, Metrans at USC, and then all our sponsors. And I want to give a shout out to my graduate transportation policy and planning class, and hope they'll help us lead the Q&A session with some very thoughtful questions. I'm expecting a question from each one of you. So feel free to use the chat box, which should be to the right of your screen. I'd like to go over to the logistics of the next 2 hours. Each panelist will present, and then I'll be asking 1 or 2 questions of those panelists before moving on to the next panelist. At the end of the 3 presentations, we will open it up to the entire group for questions. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, please use the chat box and I will record the questions to ask. We do not plan on taking a break, and we will be recording today's session. I also hope you were able to complete the pre-session survey. We'll also be sending out a post-session survey, so please also fill that out. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. I met Hassan Ikrata in the 90s when we were in the infancy of our career. And it's just been such a kick and a joy to witness firsthand the impact that Hassan has been able to make on California in the last 25 years. As Steve mentioned, Hassan is currently the executive director of the San Diego Association of Governments, also known as SANDAG. SANDAG is the leading research, planning, and transportation agency for the entire San Diego region. The agency builds consensus, creates strategic plans, obtains and allocates resources, plans, engineers, and builds public transportation, and provides information on a broad range of topics pertinent to the region's quality of life. He holds both a bachelor's and a master's degree in civil engineering and a PhD candidacy in urban planning and transportation. Hassan has more than 30 years of public and private sector transportation planning experience. Prior to joining SANDAG in 2018, he was the executive director for SCAG. He's also worked for the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, as well as the South Coast Air Quality Management District. It's a thrill to have you here today and look forward to hearing your comments, Hassan.
Thank you, Sarah. It's good to see you, and it's an honor to be with Komi and Joshua. I'm assuming you guys going to handle the slides, right?
That is correct.
Okay, so it's good to be with you, and I think wishing everyone a very quick recovery from this awful COVID-19, which we were just talking about with the panelists, that nobody knows what the other end of this, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine news in the last few weeks. But wishing you all a great recovery. And this is relevant because a lot of people are asking the question, will our long-range planning change because of COVID? And my answer was still and will continue to be, it's too early to tell what would a long-term impact of COVID be on a plan that spans 3 or 4 decades. So if I go to the next slide, San Diego is a 3.3 million region, has in it the second largest city in California, the 8th largest in the country. And when I joined SANDAG about 23 months ago, I got my hand on a cover of a National Geographic magazine that talks about future cities. And so we stole the idea from the National Geographic. We just installed San Diego, and we connected it with all these green lines of priced highways, transit, and goes to that white star, which we call the San Diego Grand Central. That's how we developed the vision. So 23 years ago, I asked my staff of 400 here, I said, reimagine the future of transportation system. And obviously, as Komi and Joshua knows, traditionally over the last 5 decades, we look at transportation as highways versus transit, this versus that, and it didn't work. Most of us still drive, even though we invested heavily in other modes, and we still have the ills of congestion, bad air quality, greenhouse gas emissions. So we thought, okay, how do we do it differently? And if you go to the next slide, Sarah, and we really thought that if we look at transportation purely from going faster, cleaner, and safer, and having a system that's fairer, we have to present somehow a transportation system that reimagines the future, and it doesn't have to be a modal competition. It can be a modal integration, a modal collaboration. It can be so that you provide people choices and let them choose, but for that, you have to price a system right for them to do that choices. Go to the next slide, please. So what we, the next one, what we did in San Diego was something different. We thought for a future transportation system, we really needed multiple strategies. We call them the 5 big moves, 5 strategies. complete corridors, transit leap, mobility hub, flexible fleet, and mixed operating system. And we don't think any of this will work independently. And we didn't think that any of them could say, I could exist as a strategy for the future without the others. And I'm going to go into more detail of these 5 strategies. Go to the next slide, please. So the first one we call complete corridors. San Diego County has about 12 corridors. Obviously, when you compare that to the SCAG region, we get lost in like comparison. I mean, we're talking about 4,000 acres compared to 39,000 acres, right? But yet we have a very 12 distinct corridor in San Diego. And most of the corridors right now is obviously overwhelmed by the car. 97% of the people commute, do their all trips by car. But we thought, well, listen, if you look at the complete corridor and you say, I'm going to offer multiple choices that are comparable, that if you drive, it takes you 20 minutes. If you take transit, it takes you 20 minutes. And if you even decide to take what we call the flexible fleet, it takes you the same. But you can't have an option that takes 20 minutes and other that takes 2 hours, which is the case right now. So if I'm coming from the border in San Diego and going to the UCSD and I drive, probably in a congested time will take me about 45 to 60 minutes. But if I take transit, it will take me about 2.5 hours. These are not really choices. So a complete corridor means you provide choices that's comparable to each other. The next slide, please. The transit leap, right now we have about 54 miles of light rail in San Diego. And if you ask experts here, say, why did we put the lines where they are today? The only explanation they could come up with is, well, these are an old railroad line, we're going to make them for passenger, and therefore we put it this way. 54 miles of light rail, and we're proud of it. It's a light rail system that really could potentially be great. A transit leap in our planning take that to about 350 miles of urban commuter and light rail. For San Diego, that's very significant. So a transit leap, for it to the right, has to connect places, have to be underground if need be, and have to be above ground if needs be, and have to go where people live and work, not just simply where right of way exists. The next slide, please. Then the third big move is what they call the mobility hubs. Next, please. And mobility hubs are those places where you could make a transfer. This is, yeah, back a slide. Okay. Where you could actually change modes, you could live and work. You could go entertain, you could watch a movie. So mobility hubs are places like LA Union Station or like New York Grand Central. In the region, we're thinking of about 30 mobility hubs, different in scale, that could be a strategy for connecting the transportation systems. Next, please. This is an example of a mobility hub where you have a train station, you have rental car facilities, you have coffee shops, you have people living and working and walking. Next, please. So, and the last of the 5 big moves is absolutely technology. How you gonna, we call it the next operating system, how you gonna have this work with the existing and future technology advances? And that probably is the 5th strategy, is what's gonna make sense of all of this. So what differentiates this from other planning efforts that we did? So this is the first time actually in San Diego we do what's called a data-based planning process. We started with data that didn't exist before, and we let that data drive our planning. So the map on the right with the blue dot shows the employment centers. The map on the left shows the population densities. And when I go to the next slide and put these together, you could see now, and the blue dots here is employment center, the line is the trips, and when you concentrate the trips using legal cell phone data, you can actually beginning to create an image of not only commuter trips, but like we're gonna see, go to the next slide, Sarah. So trips for critical connections, whether it's from the border or from a port, these critical connection trips added to those first slide you saw, and you go to the next one, and given that San Diego is a military town, you also look at specialized trip, and these are all data that used to figure out, okay, how do we build these 5 strategies so that they work for San Diegans. Next slide, please. And when I talk about transit leap, it is important to remember that most people will say, well, transit ridership is down in the country. And it's true. It's down in Los Angeles. It's down here in the last few years before COVID-19. And now with COVID-19, it's down significantly, and probably be down for the next year or so. But if you build transit right, and if you build transit by thinking about not only to take that trip on the transit vehicle, but to get people to transit and from transit, and to figure out how you do that so that when you compare the total trip, it's still comparable to the car. If a transit is not as convenient, as comfortable as the car, nobody's gonna take it. But if you make it and you're willing to invest, it can. Go to the next slide, please. So this is just a map, a network that we built that shows we go from 54 miles to 350 miles of commuter, heavy rail, next generation rapid bus. And one thing about San Diego is if you look at those population maps, most people live in the western 1/3 of the region. And San Diego truly is an island. You have Mexico, you have the ocean, you have obviously the mountain, and you have the Marines to protect us from LA, from Comey and Joshua, in case they decide to do something funny. And so it's an island, but yes, most urban form is designed in such a way that you can't go outside too much. So it lends itself to actually designing a transportation system that works. Go to the next slide, please. And we talked about mobility hubs. There's about 30 around the region. If you go to the next one, where they're different in size. This is at San Isidro at the border, where you could have flexible fleets feeding the trains, where you could actually have a mixed land use development. To the next, please. Next one. Keep going, the complete corridor. Next one. Now, the complete corridors and for the highway, obviously the highways is gonna still handle most of the trips. How do you add capacity without adding general purpose lanes? And politically unpopular, but you have to price these lanes to make it effective and to bring capacity to it. But also you have to price it so you make your other modes comparable to it. And a complete corridor is about a price system that provides choices so you won't penalize people. But at the end of the day, you get capacity increases overall into the system by moving more people. Next, please. And goes without saying, technology today could do amazing things. We could actually dynamically figure out how to change the number of lanes in a direction by utilizing technology. Technology also today could be used for the future electric fleet. At San Diego, we're actually probably will be one of the first place in the country to try what's called conductive charging. We're working with French companies that used to be a subsidiary of Qualcomm here in San Diego to put charging in a pavement. We're going to do a pilot of 2 miles where you actually could be charging as you drive over the pavement. It's a technology in its start, but this is giving where if the future fleet is going to be all electric, it really would help to have such a technology. But technology is going to play an amazing role in the next transportation system. Next, please. And we talked about the mobility hubs, and one of the things, if you go to the next slide, one of the things that these are the 30 mobility hubs I talked about around the region. And one of the biggest one is in downtown, we'd call San Diego Grand Central, or it's like the LA Union Station for San Diego. Next, please. And this one is located next to the Marine base. It's owned actually by the military, which the Navy. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States Navy. It's about 72 acres. And the MOU with the Navy is we will build the transportation hub, a connection to the airport, which is a mile northwest of there. And then the Navy will get their building for cybersecurity, and we will have a mixed land use development, about 12 million square foot of development, which is almost as big as San Diego downtown. That's the idea of San Diego Grand Central. If you go to the next one, this is architectural images. Next, please. Next one. Yeah, this is back one slide, Sarah. Yeah, this one. It said architect Gordon Carrier developed this image of the Grand Central. This is looking west to Point Loma in San Diego. But the idea of transportation linking to urban form is something we always talked about, but we never really figured out. And so our hope here by designing these 5 strategies, we link it to the urban form. We have to change land use. And we have to do that by pricing a system right. And once you do that, you actually be able to say, okay, I'm having a system of the future that gives people choices, but that works. And that also does all the things we're trying to do in California, reduce greenhouse gas emission, move us in a sustainable future. Next, please, Sarah. Flexible fleet, you don't need a big bus or a long train to move people within 2-3 miles. Flexible fleet are the Uber and Lyft model, except in this case, they will be operated from the mobility hubs. And I think that model could work if you design it in the context of 5 strategies we talk about. Next, please. This is, to me, is the flexible shuttle of the future. We all seen these images of future technology, but these technologies that we're talking about exist today for transportation. Next, please. One more. These are examples of the mobility hubs and the flexible fleets that already actually a couple of pilots in San Diego. This is in Carlsbad. Next, please. And the next operating system is how these all strategies are going to work together. It is an app operated system. And we have a couple of examples, and then I'll show you a video and I'll conclude. I know I'm almost at my time. So go to the next slide. This is a real example actually of a person who commutes from the border to Sorrento Valley, about 30 miles. And now she and her husband own one car. They have to drop their kid to daycare. And right now that trip in the car takes about an hour. And if you take the 5 strategies we're talking about, with the choices we're talking about, she could do the trip within an hour, but at a much safer and much cheaper cost for her and her family. I'm not going to go through the example, but we played this example. You go to the next slide, please, through technology, where you could actually see this is what we have today, typical current trip. The next trip with the operating system, how that works, and the choices presented. app operated. Next, please. So the idea of the next operating system is technology is going to play a major role in us designing our transportation trip before leaving our homes. Next, please. Now to just the final slide is our vision is simply, and if you keep clicking, Sarah, is about a priced network, highway network, a transit leap with mobility hubs, with a flexible fleet, and with the technology linking all of this together for San Diego, which, by the way, it is, even though you see all these lines, mostly is the urban part is the 1/3 of the western part. And with that, I'd like to go to play the video, and then I'll come back for a final slide. You can't hear it, can you? So some issue, some technical difficulties here with the sound.
Transportation isn't just about getting us from point A to point B. It's about connecting us to each other, to our environment, to our communities, connecting us to everything and everyone we love. But congestion and the absence of alternatives are breaking these connections, creating a divide between where we are and where we want to be.
It's okay. We don't need to play the video if we can't hear it. Okay, no problem. So the videos, the idea of the video, we put an image of these 5 transportation strategies for San Diego. What the complete corridor, the transit leap, the mobility hub, the flexible fleet, and the next operating system, and how would this work together as a system? And finally, I just want to say, in every region, I think Komi and Joshua will agree, you cannot just rely on fixed guideways to solve your transportation problem, whether that's the highway or transit. You have to provide the flexibility, and you have to do the politically unpopular things. And you say, I'm going to look at transportation as a public good, and it has to be priced right for it to work. So I will guarantee you, no transit system anywhere would work without, 1, making it go to where people want to go, and 2, without making sure that the choices are comparable on prices. The perception of driving today is really, it's the cheaper option. And therefore, we need to work on all of these things. So thank you very much, Sarah and Richie, for having us. I will be happy afterward to be ready to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Hassan, and I'm sorry about the video. It worked when we first test ran it, and I don't know.
Okay.
We're trying. But that was incredibly interesting. And if I can ask you just a couple questions, and then later we'll get everyone else's questions in. But as you know, we had an election 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And as they say, all politics are local. And it's my understanding that the San Diego elected leadership really became all Democratic. And I'm wondering if that will make an impact on the 5 big moves. Will you be able to make it happen sooner, or will it delay it? I mean, is there any impact whatsoever?
So Sarah, I'll be happy to report to you, and I did send Komi some articles that were printed in the Union Tribune here. There actually, the election was all around San Diego's initiative, the 5 big moves. The mayoral candidate, one of them said, I supported, and the other one said no. The one who said, well, the newspaper before the election is over said, there's 5 big moves, and Mr. Ekrata's 10 years is going to be very short if these candidates win, which was true. I mean, Tati Gloria won the election. If Barbara Brie won the election, I don't think the 5 big moves will have a chance. The same thing, the supervisory became majority Democrats the first time in history of San Diego. And the same thing, the 5 big moves in the transportation system. So to answer your question directly, I think the election moved this plan much further to reality, because this would require a voter-approved sales tax, another one that would generate with the existing one about $1 billion a year. It's an expensive system, it's 177 billion total cost. But now the election resulted in candidates who publicly said, we're all about this strategy, we're going to support it.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm sure you've reached out to the community. What have you done to get their input in developing this vision for San Diego?
Honestly, this probably in my career the most extensive outreach for an urban region we ever did. And the communities are hungry for choices, for sure. You have to remember, not all San Diegans live on the coast and own $5 million homes. There is a significant number of the population are low incomes, minorities, live in the South, and they have very limited options when it comes to transportation. And there is also limited economic option, and I think transportation should lead to economic development. I know that Joshua will probably talk about this. If transportation does not get into a situation where you at least encourage economic development, then you're not doing your job, whether it's through the P3, the public-private partnership, or other mechanism. So these communities, at least the one we reached out to, and we've done significant, probably over 200 gathering with great attendance around San Diego, are saying, yeah, we want a different future, but we wanted to make sure that it leads to economic development. And finally, Sarah, I think the outreach that we did, clearly the young generation are aspiring to a system that's driven by apps and technology, whereas probably my generation would probably be, yeah, okay, great, another idea of transportation system, just build me my lane kind of thing. But it's mostly positive. Obviously, we need 2/3 of San Diegans to think it's positive enough for them to pay for it. But I think it's been a very positive outreach.
Well, it's very exciting, and I so appreciate you sharing it with us. And I know there'll be many more questions for you in about 30 minutes. Our next panelist is Dr. Joshua Shank. Joshua is the first ever Chief Innovation Officer at the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, where he leads the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. The role of this office is to champion new ideas to improve mobility in LA County by informing the high-level vision for LA Metro, piloting and implementing new and experimental programs and policy, and serving as the primary liaison for new ideas relevant to LA Metro coming from entrepreneurs, established private sector entities, academia, and even individual residents. The office is also responsible for the public-private partnership program and the strategic planning functions. Prior to joining LA Metro, Joshua was president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation, which is a national nonprofit think tank. He also was a transportation policy advisor to Senator Hillary Clinton during the development of the last surface transportation authorization bill, SAFE-TLU. I'm excited to hear what you have to say today, Joshua. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah. Happy to be here and happy to have a chance to talk to everyone. I love doing this class or your class in person typically, and this is the next best thing, I suppose. And it's great to be here with both Komi and Hassan, because they always have really excellent ideas to share, and I learned something from them as well. You're going to find a lot of things I'm going to say are very consistent with what Hassan was saying, not all that surprising. We are the largest city in California and the largest county in the United States in terms of population. Still, Komi, of course, has the bigger the bigger area to brag about. So he can brag even more than Hassan and I about how large our areas are. But the thing I want to talk about and start with respect to mobility innovation is, what do we think about when we think about innovation and mobility? Because Hassan just detailed a lot of things that would represent substantial innovation and major change in San Diego. But what I thought was noticeable about them, and you'll see this in the things that I'm talking about as well, is while technology plays a role and is a critical tool for accomplishing these things, we're not doing it because of the technology. The technology isn't what's driving it. What's driving it is the need to change how we get around and how our cities are organized, because the way it currently is being done doesn't work. It doesn't work well in Los Angeles. I think it works a little better in San Diego from my experience, but still doesn't work very well. And it doesn't work well primarily because we've created a system that is almost entirely dependent on a completely unsustainable mode of transportation, which is everyone gets their own personal vehicle and we try to build enough capacity on the roadways to accommodate that. And we keep thinking, well, if we just build a little bit more, then we'll have enough room for all these people who want to drive alone. And we're always wrong. And yet we continue to go down that path for decades. And so at some point you have to say, maybe that path isn't working. Let's try some other ideas, which is exactly what Hassan just presented. So I'll talk about some of those ideas. But even though we're the innovation office, we are not the technology office. And you'll see that the things that we're thinking about in this space are not driven by the technology. They're driven by the goals, the strategic planning goals that we've developed for the organization. And that's where we come out. So let's start with, what is the goal of our organization? You mentioned in my introduction, the strategic planning function that we have. And the reason we have a strategic planning function in the innovation office is that you can't possibly innovate and get where you're going faster if you don't know where you're going in the first place. So we hadn't had a strategic plan at Los Angeles Metro for over a decade when Phil Washington became the CEO here and created this office. And lots of things have changed in that time, for sure, including lots of money that had been set aside for construction of major capital projects. But one thing that hadn't changed is that nothing had been fixed about the transportation system. In fact, it had gotten worse. More people were buying cars than ever, fewer people were riding transit than ever, and congestion was just certainly worse and worse. So we decided that the reason that people, we didn't decide, we surveyed people and found out that the reason that people were giving us their tax money was not because they wanted to see lots of nice things being built. They gave us their tax money because they didn't like the current system and wanted to see a change. And the main thing they didn't like about the current system is that it was extremely congested. And therefore, if we're going to put forward a strategic plan and say what our goals are, we have to start with the goal that we're not trying just to get people to ride transit. We are trying to improve mobility and accessibility for the region. And once you shift that goal away from the traditional goal of a transit agency, and I know Hassan and Comey don't represent transit agencies, but most transit agencies have a goal of, let's get more people to use our product, which is understandable. But getting more people to use our product won't actually solve the challenge that people are giving us their money to solve. We can get, let's say we get transit ridership back on the upswing, and we grow by a huge amount after COVID. It's very unlikely, but let's say we did that, and we get from 1.3 million riders a day to 1.5 million riders a day. Do you think that there will no longer be congestion in Los Angeles? No, there'll still be, and that would take a tremendous effort to do that. So rather than try to think about it that way, we think about, well, how do we get more trips to be taken in things other than single occupancy vehicles? That's the approach that we take in our strategic plan. And once you start with that approach, you wind up with some very different ideas that move forward compared to traditional transit agencies. And I'll give you a few examples of those. And one is, if we want more people to not drive alone, then shared ride mobility services make a lot of sense as far as helping people find alternatives that aren't just waiting for a bus that might come every 30 minutes or trying to find their way to one of our rail stations that is usually a pretty long distance from their home or office, but is instead an on-demand service that combines some of the positives of automobiles. Like, it's very direct. It's gonna, pick you up and drop you off close to where you're going. You don't have to necessarily change vehicles, with the positives of transit, where you have shared rides, and you're able to maximize the value of each trip by getting enough people on it, and you're able to make it affordable for people. So we have pursued two partnerships along those lines. The first was we received an unsolicited proposal to create our own on-demand mobility service, which is called Metro Micro and is launching next month, and is an on-demand service with shared rides that is operated by our employees, by employees of our organization. LA Metro has over 10,000 employees. A lot of them are operators. And these operators will have the opportunity to operate smaller vehicles that are on demand and operate in several zones within LA County. Now, Metro Micro is an example of how technology can be used to accomplish one of our goals, which is to provide a better service that might get more people to think, you know what, maybe I don't have to drive alone. Maybe I don't have to take an Uber or Lyft. Maybe I can use this service that is a little bit more attractive than traditional public transit. But what it also does is it provides an affordable alternative, similar to Uber and Lyft, for people who might not find that service to be accessible at the moment because they can't afford it, because they're disabled for any number of reasons. So we're combining some of the best elements of a public agency with some of the innovation from the private sector in offering a much better service. And what's interesting is we had already been piloting before Metro Micro, which hasn't launched yet, it'll launch next month. Before that launched, we had already been piloting our mobility on demand service, and we saw immediately the benefits of an on-demand service. So let me tell you what that is. Mobility on demand brings people to and from 3 of our stations in LA County. And it helps people near the station who otherwise might face challenges getting there, get to and from the station in a shared ride vehicle. The private sector, in this case, does all the operations. We are just helping to fund it and make sure that it is affordable, that it's accessible to everyone, and that you can get one without having a smartphone, because that is a challenge for many people who ride our system, is they may not have a smartphone or a data plan. And so we wanted to make sure this was accessible to them as well. So we started that partnership almost 2 years ago now. And when the pandemic hit, this was one of the tools we had available that was able to adjust much more readily than our existing transit network, right? Our existing transit network is large and bulky and generally fixed. The changes you can make take time, and it's not so simple to just say, well, now there's a pandemic, so let's completely rework the system. But for this partnership, it actually was much simpler. A few things that we did. One is we got rid of the shared ride component, because now during COVID, people didn't want to share rides with strangers, nor should they be sharing rides with strangers. Second, we extended the service so it wasn't just first last mile services within a zone, but that you could get to anywhere within a zone using this service, providing critical mobility for people who might otherwise be stranded during the pandemic because they don't have vehicles, and this was a way for them to get around. Third, we extended the service beyond the zones to essential destinations where people could go to doctor's offices or drugstores or grocery stores who might otherwise not be able to get there. And then fourth, we added a food delivery component to bring food from food banks to people who needed it, who couldn't get out to get the food from the food bank because they were stuck at home due to COVID, or they had to take care of a child. So that's a great example of how, when you set up a partnership with a private company and you have the flexibility, you can adjust to a situation much more readily if that partnership is set up appropriately in the first place. And it's, again, an example of, it's not that we said, oh, we need to bring in this new technology. It was that we saw a need. We saw that the technology could help address that need. And then it turned out that that technology could help in a totally new way as well as the pandemic evolved. So On-demand mobility services are a great example of mobility innovation that comes about when you start thinking about your goals a little bit differently. But let me give you another example that I think is really critical, and again, touches on a lot of what Hassan was talking about, and that's our traffic reduction study. If we are serious about reducing traffic in Los Angeles County, which is certainly a monumental task, we absolutely have to consider the possibility that allowing our roadway space to be given away for free is one of the challenges that we face, one of the reasons for the challenges that we face. That because we don't price our roads, and we do price our transit system, by the way, but we don't price the use of our roads, that is a great incentive for people to use as much of the roadway as they like. And it's not surprising that they would overuse it when you price it at zero. So we thought that looking for a way to pilot the use of congestion pricing within Los Angeles County would be a way to demonstrate the power of this innovation. And again, this is not driven by the technology. We didn't say, oh, the technology now allows us to do congestion pricing, let's do it. But the fact is that without technology, congestion pricing becomes a lot more challenging, and we are able to do it more easily than we used to in the past. But the traffic reduction study, what it does is it looks at how we can find a partner within the LA region that would be willing to experiment with this. So that's one of the advantages actually of Los Angeles compared to many other cities, is because we don't have one specific center where almost everyone is going, and because our everything's so dispersed, we didn't have to say, well, let's try congestion pricing in downtown LA, which is what has happened in every other city that's implemented it, right? Like if you look at Singapore, Stockholm, London, Milan, it's all a congestion charge to get into a central area. But LA has a different kind of problem. We have lots of different centers. And if we just confine ourselves to one area, we might face a lot of resistance from people who are like, well, why are you picking on that area? Why not this other area? So instead we said, why don't we find a partner that would be willing to pilot this? There's 88 cities in LA County. If we could find one or two of them that wanted to try this thing and see if it reduced congestion, then we might be able to demonstrate the value. And so that's exactly what we've been doing. We have been working with our partners across the region. And in fact, the mayor of Los Angeles has made the development of a pilot area one of his signature programs as while he is the chair of Los Angeles County Metro. So he wants to volunteer the largest city in the county, the city of Los Angeles, to be a part of this. And that's great. The value of pricing the roads is really critical, but you cannot get to it simply by saying, well, this is a great idea, so let's do it. In fact, we don't even have the legal authority to do it in Los Angeles County. That doesn't stop us. No one really can stop you from doing something you don't have the legal authority to do. You have to first say that you're going to do it. You have to convince people of the value, and then you go after the legal authority. So we're gonna work through that over the next several years. But the critical issue to keep in mind is it's not that we are trying to create a system where people don't like to drive anymore and therefore use other modes. The primary benefit of congestion pricing actually goes to the people who are driving cars because they get where they're going much faster. It is also a nice side benefit that people will choose to use other modes besides driving alone in order to get where they're going, because it now becomes much more convenient for them to do so. Since now, as part of any congestion pricing package, we would be upgrading the transit service within that area. We'd be upgrading bicycle and pedestrian options. We'd put it together as a package of mobility improvements. We're not just talking about coming in and imposing pricing on the roads and walking away. It doesn't work that way. So that's very exciting, and we'll be coming to the board with a proposed pilot area in June. And then finally, I wanted to mention the Recovery Task Force. We have created an internal recovery task force at Metro that is looking at how we can emerge from this pandemic in a better position than we were going into it. Because as I already mentioned, going into it didn't look so good. Lots of traffic, lots of inequities, lots of challenges. And rather than just say, okay, the pandemic's over, everyone has vaccine, that's great, let's revert back to where we were before, which to me seems like a disaster. and a tremendous waste of an opportunity. Instead, we want to come up with, what do we do now so that we don't just go back to that? And we have several recommendations that we're going to be putting forward in order to achieve that. One is, I think we've all enjoyed having less traffic. We've all enjoyed having streets that more people can walk and bike on safely. We've already created a the LADOT has created a slow streets program during the pandemic where cars are slowed down and they're primarily for bicycles and pedestrians. These are the kinds of things that we want to maintain and not just leave behind after the pandemic's over. A second thing is we want to make sure that we're looking at what kind of incentives we can provide to encourage people to shift behavior, right? Because the default in LA County has always been, for most people, drive alone to get to most destinations. But now this is a window in which people are all experiencing, okay, well, maybe I don't have to do that because I'm working from home, or maybe I don't have to do that as frequently, or maybe I've enjoyed the fact that I can bike on the streets safely now and I don't want to get back in a car. So during this window is a great time to go to businesses around the county and say, hey, do you want to help incentivize your workers to consider other options besides driving alone, including telecommuting, but including transit and anything else that will help people not to drive alone. And that's why we've created a program that will use an app to incentivize people and push them towards non-single occupancy vehicle modes. And then finally, one of the most critical recommendations I think the task force is going to come out with has to do with how we talk to the public about what we're doing. Because so often our public outreach is dominated by the loudest voices in the room, and the loudest voices in the room are not necessarily the people who are actually customers of our system. A lot of times, for example, we go out to build a new bus rapid transit route, or we go out to build a new rail line, and who do we hear from at public meetings? We largely hear from the people who are living in the area, who don't want to see any change to the area, but have no intention of ever getting on public transit, nor any need to get on public transit. And the people who actually ride the system, who ride it all the time, even now, when we're still at 50% of ridership, they're not able to come to the public meeting, probably because they're working 2 or 3 jobs and they don't have time to come to the public meeting, or maybe because they aren't aware of it because they're not as connected. So we have to do a better job of public outreach to make sure that those voices are heard if we want to be successful in getting these projects done, and if we want to be successful in actually serving our customers more effectively. So we want to come out of this pandemic with a new outreach plan that ensures that the voices are heard from some of the more vulnerable people in society who typically have been left out of these discussions. And that's one of the primary reasons why we have challenges in delivering an effective transit system. I mean, if you look at Los Angeles, I say this all the time, and I think I first heard it from some folks at UCLA, where I know Hassan also went, that Los Angeles has the best transportation system in the world. We're just using it completely ineffectively because we've got all these miles and miles of pavement and road space we've set aside for vehicles that we could be using to transport people on buses, to transport people in carpools, to use van pools, to use bikes, anything, but we've chosen to use the least efficient mode as our primary mode, which is single occupancy vehicles. And as a result, the system doesn't function well at all. And it's highly inequitable. So if we're able to make that change, it's less about how much infrastructure we build and much more about carving out on existing infrastructure the space for people in buses, the space for people who are not using single occupancy vehicle modes. And rather than continue to devote all of our resources to single occupancy vehicles, shifting those resources towards everything else. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish. And that's really, to me, what mobility innovation is about at LA Metro. So thanks so much. Great to talk to you guys.
Thank you, Joshua. And it's fantastic to hear about all the innovations that are happening, not only in San Diego, but in Los Angeles, and that the last 8 months has not slowed your agencies down at all. Some exciting news last week when I read that your boss, the CEO of LA Metro, was leading the transition team for President-elect Biden's transportation area. And I'm wondering if you can give us any kind of hints as to some of the initiatives that might be proposed, or what we might be able to look forward to under the new administration, transportation-wise.
Well, I don't have any special insight into that information, but I can tell you a couple of things that certainly I'm thinking about, and others at Metro are thinking about. I mean, one is some money has to be made available for capital infrastructure because so much of the money that we've lost in revenue and sales tax revenue was intended to go to those major infrastructure projects, and we can't build them without that money. But a lot of money also has to be given to the operations of our system, because transit agencies around the country are suffering and won't last much longer without a federal infusion of funds to help with our operations. And those are essential services for some of the most vulnerable people in society. So we absolutely have to keep them going. But the key thing that I would advocate for, if I were able to, is to provide the types of grants that we saw, like under the Tiger program that Obama, when the Obama administration, where you incentivize local regions to try to accomplish specific goals, and you reward the ones that are taking those political risks. Because right now, the biggest challenge I face, or we face in LA County, is that the political risks associated with things like carving out space for bus lanes are huge for local officials. They don't want to do it. They don't want to go to their community and say, we're taking away a lane of traffic and putting in a bus, because they'll get shouted at. They might lose their re-election. But if they can go there and say, hey, if you want to use this federal money over here, I got to take this lane. I'm sorry, I have no choice. The federal government's making me do it. And in order to get this money for all the things that you want, I have to take away this lane of traffic. I think that's a better argument for them and more likely to be successful. So I'd love any kind of federal grant program that creates those kinds of incentives.
You're giving a little hint to Phil, or? My other question was going to be about the microtransit programs, but there's been a lot of questions on the Q&A about it, so I think I'll save it for when I ask you the general questions, and we'll go on to our last panelist, which is Kome Ajise. Kome, it's a thrill to have you here. Kome is the executive director of SCAG. He has 3 decades of experience in regional planning and transportation, most recently as the director of planning at SCAG. Prior to working at SCAG, he was the chief deputy director at Caltrans, where he was responsible for internal operations, overseeing more than 18,000 employees and a budget in excess of $1.1 billion. Previously, he was Caltrans deputy director of planning and modal programs and oversaw the aeronautics, mass transportation, rail, transportation planning, local assistance, and research innovation and system information divisions. I want you to know, I've worked with Caltrans for years, and I never knew they had some of those verticals. It's kind of exciting to read. Kome has a bachelor's degree in geography and regional planning and a master's in city and regional planning. And it's a thrill to have you here. So welcome, and look forward to hearing your comments.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Stephen and ITS. It's really an honor to be with both Josh and Hassan. And I think they've laid the ground really well with talking about policy and technology. And so I'm going to try not to brag about the size of SCAG and all of that, because I think that was expected. I'm going to talk about a smaller program that we're working on. And this is probably going to be nostalgic for Hassan, because it actually took root and blossomed while he was still here at SCAG. Back 3 years ago, the whole notion of big data and open data was a very big thing, and Hassan was a champion of that. And our board actually put together a program called the Future Communities Pilot Program, or Future Communities Initiative. And somebody's going to run the slides, I assume. Thank you. So the intent of the program, if you can go to the second slide, the intent of the program was really to bring about the energizing of municipal action, including plan development, including data-driven decision-making at the local level. with the data that we have at SCAG. We're sort of a clearinghouse for data, and how could we use that information, that data, and turn it into intelligence and information for folks to use. The document that you see here is really, it's driven by the strategic plan that we have at SCAG. So it was kind of fun to hear Josh talk about strategic planning, and really was intended to help SCAG also be at the leadership position in terms of bringing all of our communities, all 191 cities, if you will, into the forefront of using data for decision making. This program was partially funded by the Air District through the Mobile Source Air Pollution Reduction Review Committee, MSRC. And it was intended to basically apply technology and data analytics to the reduction of emissions, or VMT, as it were, in local travel and also in municipal operations. Other goals of the program was to ensure that there was some consideration for disadvantaged communities, and these are communities that are often left behind and tend to bear the brunt of emissions in our communities, in our region. And so when we start to look at making municipal services streamlined and more efficient with the use of data, we also have in mind that we look at the benefits to the disadvantaged communities. The next slide. And I think I just talked through some of these. We can go to the next slide, which sort of shows there are 8 pilot programs, pilot projects that we are working on right now. And what we try to do at SCAG, because we don't have the same implementing authority that LA Metro or SANDAG have, where they can actually go out and build stuff and you can do a ribbon cutting to it. We don't do that typically at SCAG. What we try to do mostly is to enable others to act. And so the intent of this program was to provide grants to our cities and have them do things that are related to this program. And then once they're done, be able to share that information across the region and diffuse the innovation that comes out of this process. So we have these 8 pilots going on. 4 are in LA County. 1 is in Orange County, 2 in San Bernardino, and 1 in Riverside. The recurring theme and ideas that we found in these different pilots is along the lines of optimizing tasks and making sure that activities that cities are carrying out are put to the rigors of using technology to optimize them. So there's also a part of it that requires them to, as we look through at the end of the pilots, there are some deliverables that we're looking at to see how it also affects our communities of concern. The next slides will highlight 3 pilots. But before I get to those 3 pilots, the pilots are integrated to bring technology and GHG reduction together. The pilots were the 3 pilots that we're going to show for Anaheim, Ontario, and LA DOT. They really are, in the main, they sort of foster a reasonably controlled environment for evaluating the proposals that we saw. We needed to establish a consistent way of quantifying the outcomes such that we can use comparable metrics and KPIs to assess performance and be able to express the performance indicators that come out of it. Now, since the individual pilots vary in scope and transportation impact or the market that they serve, data collection will obviously have to be tailored to the results of the defined metrics that we set forward. We have 5 categories that we had set out in terms of defined indicators, and they're listed here. Additionally, we also had some data collection requirements so that we we could hopefully kick the tires at the end of all of this to make sure that there is verification in the work that's been submitted. Indicators like air quality and VMT are particularly important to us, given that we also are charged with keeping the emissions budget in the region relative to transportation. So that's important to us. And it's also important to us on how our disadvantaged communities will feel the brunt of the poor air quality that we have that's impacting them mostly by VMT and impacting them the most in the region. We also take a look at creating a more equitable region with factors like when factors like this become more vital for us to focus on. On the next slide. Now, each of the 5 categories are again have potential data points that I think would allow us to be able to express very clearly what we're getting out of this process. Now, in the case of the city of Anaheim, they're harnessing technology and using electric shuttles to reduce high polluting short trips. We've always felt like short trips are the low-hanging fruit of VMT reduction, and we've addressed it with active transportation in some cases. And I think LA Metro's work is also very important in this area with microtransit. The idea is there are short trips that people take where they just mindlessly get in their cars, however big the car or the truck might be, to go a mile or 2 miles to go get something that they could have biked to or walked to. But lack of facilities or maybe capacity sometimes would enable that VMT that's so unnecessary. And so the work here is to use technology, parking technology, for example, unique apps, last mile, first mile connections, part of what Anaheim is doing under their FRAN program, FRAN being free rides around the neighborhood. This project covers about a 1.9 square mile area that they're seeing to use the technologies I just defined, that I just mentioned on. We also see Anaheim making their city more accessible, which is an equity issue, and they're cutting down on the need for a car that helps the communities to be less likely to be dependent on the single occupant vehicle, and therefore help the environment with regards to meeting some of the state objectives by reducing emissions. The next slide. The City of Ontario has actually always been a step ahead in technology with their Ontario Net fiber and broadband network that they have had in place. And so this is an additive to that. They propose a system-wide solution to smart city upgrades. The city's goal here is to foster an environment capable of supporting multiple pilots at once, and the first step is through this what they call the rapid validation hub, and so this is again based on the fact that they've done the work earlier on many years ago to have the entire main city just laid with fiber broadband network. So what this does is beyond what they've done where they've made fiber available to startup companies and city-supported business incubators, this resource is sort of additive to that. The effort here will likely make high-quality broadband accessible to low-income disadvantaged communities. Is one of the hopefully the outcomes of this. Lastly, they also have a shared e-scooter program in the downtown area that also would help reduce VMT by providing that alternative first and last mile gaps and short trips as well. And so as downtown revitalization continues in Ontario, I would expect that this would allow us to see more an expanded use of technology to reduce VMT. The next slide. So the next slide is LA DOT, what they're trying to do is to better verify VMT impacts. There's a lot of stuff that we do, and we never really quite know what the impact is on VMT as we, as we go forward. So this is more of a way of trying to get to that and get the benefits of their car share services along with other app-enabled mobility services and what they're hoping to do here is by documenting the complete transportation behavior that people have who participate in the LA DOT's car share pilot program. And this includes the Blue LA electric vehicle car share. What it would do is expand upon LA DOT's mobility data specification, the MDS, to incorporate car share services and thus making, for those of us on the data side, this is just it's just so sweet to hear, is to make that data available, the origin destination data available on a cleaner platform, allowing the pilot to basically supplement the work that they're already doing. The survey will include before and after mode shifts information by common trip types and evaluate other factors such as auto ownership, parking demand, user satisfaction, and also identify barriers such as how the curbside is managed. What barriers do they have to utilization in the city? The project will hopefully help create a unified database of mode traveled and include bike share, car share, ductless scooters, and bus transit and microtransit. And so all of this hopefully would allow us to have a better understanding of how people travel and what the relationship of that is with technology. The next slide. So 7 of the 8 pilots are underway. Like I said, we have 8 pilots. Just talked to you about 3 of them as examples. 7 of them are underway, and COVID-19 has been a major impact on the pilots. Obviously, with the stay-at-home order, people were not out using scooters or private car shares were not available during that time. What we hope to be able to get, in the essence of this, is that the final program finding will be documented and when they're done, disseminated to promote region-wide adoption of the best practices that we are able to glean from what's going on. So as the work begins to come to fruition, hopefully in another year or so, we will begin to disseminate that. And this is the essence of the work that we do at SCAG, is to share those best practices. I think I'm going to stop there because I know you do have some time constraints.
There we go. I was having trouble unmuting myself. Thank you, Kome. I have a couple questions for you. Over the summer, I took advantage of a lot of the webinars that were being offered and a lot of the presentations. And I saw you speak several times, and you addressed the equity issue really, really well. And I want to throw this out to all 3 of you, but right now, Kome, if you wouldn't mind just articulating why it's important that we actively emphasize equity in transportation planning, and just some of the thoughts you shared over the summer, that would be wonderful.
Oh, thank you. You know, it's we've been working on equity. At least we would all claim we've been working on equity for a long time in some way or other. You know, we all have, as a result of the requirement of federal programming, environmental justice programs that seek to make sure that you don't have disparate impacts on people. And the way I've sort of come to see it, especially what this season has done for us, this reckoning that we have on race and social justice, is it's allowed us to focus a little more on the realities of the equity problem. I think we've been sort of gratifying ourselves that we're doing the work, and we've been doing the work for a while, which pains me because it's a lot of work that was for naught because we weren't focused on the issue. And so the issue being that it's not just about doing no harm, because that's basically what your environmental justice programs do, is in the execution of your programs, of your federal and state funded programs, do not harm disadvantaged communities more than basically they've been harmed. The reason that disadvantaged for the most part, and what we've seen in COVID-19 is the preponderance of the comorbidities that exist in that group are not necessarily dissociated from transportation. In fact, for the most part, some of it is as a result of transportation. And so we have to then, in the equity conversation, begin to look at more of an affirmative step to look back to see how do we correct the sins of the past. And we have to be, we have to be bold and courageous about talking about the fact that we do in fact have sins of the past. It's not a matter of conjecture. There's data, there's evidence that shows that over time we have been complicit. Not that we knowingly wanted to harm, at least most of us didn't, but we've been complicit in fathering the effects of policies that were racist and has led to the geography of segregation that we see amongst us, for example, which has continued to be perpetuated by the services that we've provided. And so one last thing to think about then, just as an example for us at SCAG, as we think about equity, we have to not just assume that when we do a call for projects, we were proud of ourselves this last RTP. We went out further than we had done before, engaging community-based organizations so that we were talking to people in disadvantaged communities, Black and Brown communities, bringing them to the table. They don't typically come to our meetings, but we wanted to hear from them. We were proud of ourselves for doing that. But the reality of that is they don't have the capacity to participate for the long haul, to stay at the table. And so we've set this table, regional table, for conversation, and we feel like we've made it as broad as possible. We've made it as equitable as possible. But what we are now faced with is the fact that there might be segments of our population that can't even be at the table, not because they don't want to, they don't even know how to be at the table. And so we have to then devote some of our resources to capacity building as part of equity. And so when I was talking to our CEOs, the 6 county CEOs about this in passing, and I think they all get it, is we're used to spreading resources geographically, making sure we have geographical balance. We have to really think about, maybe that's not equitable because where the needs might be may suggest that geographic spread is actually inequitable because you're missing focus on where the needs might be. So there is a lot, I could say more about equity, but that's sort of where we're coming at as an example on dealing with equity in regional planning.
Sarah, if I may just.
I wanted to tell the group that are on today that Mobility 21 held a summit. Mobility 21 is a Southern California group that advocates transportation issues. And their closing session was on equity. And it had every CEO and director of transportation agencies in Southern California participate. So Kome and Hassan participated, and Joshua's boss, Phil Washington, participated. And it was a discussion that lasted an hour and a half, and it was so impactful. And I have the YouTube recording of it that I've shared with my class, and I'm happy to share it with anybody who's watching this today. It is fantastic. And Hassan, you were visibly moved by the discussion. And so I'll throw it now. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I just wanted to share that and make sure I didn't forget.
Thank you. And I think Kome eloquently went through this, but you know, a 30-year career and a pre-qualifying proposal in equity in transportation, we're really good at reciting history of how equity in transportation never been achieved, and divided communities and, you know, discriminating against some communities, and we practice it until today. And in San Diego, clearly I can give you 20 examples. So I know some of the questions in the chat was about Phil Washington took to his board bravely a fairless transit. What about the transit? And I discussed it with my board several times, and my board pretty much saying, oh my God, we already subsidize transit too much. What do you mean fairless transit? And I come back to them and said, have you ever calculated how much we subsidize the automobile, for example? And you know, it goes into the discussion. I think it is time, like Komi said, to start stopping this theoretical exercise of, you know, just to put it plainly, right now is we checking the box that everybody is screwed equally moving forward. Therefore, who's was screwed in the past, the hell with them. But there is a lot of sins from past transportation. And for the first time, I feel it's a personal journey for me. I feel like in my position, I could be impactful in telling people it's no longer checking the box. It's a real thing. It's real people. And every single set of analysis and data we do highlight the same thing, that minorities, people of color are really getting hammered. I mean, our chief economist here did some analysis in COVID-19. You know, communities of Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, community of colors are 5 to 10 times more likely to be impacted economically and from transportation standpoint. Some of you know, should we have fairless transit? Should we, what happened when we price the highways? Are we gonna hurt the poor? Are all these discussion, like Joshua alluded to in the congestion pricing, all of these discussion, we have to tackle it from the standpoint that admitting that we have inequitable issues in transportation is not enough. We have to go to the next step.
Thank you. And Joshua, I just wanted to throw it open to you because I know it's an issue that's very important to you as well. And I've heard you talk about it also very articulately.
Yeah, so you know, we've developed. Well, we hired a equity officer of equity and race, and she developed an equity tool that we're now using to, you know, to analyze everything we do through that prism, so that we know whether we're doing it in the most equitable manner possible. But you know, just to give you a sense of the challenges we face, and that doesn't mean we're not going to take them on, but we are. But you know, think about how we pay for our transportation system in Los Angeles right now. It's primarily through sales taxes, and sales taxes are a regressive tax. That is not a way to pay for the transportation system that helps equity. In fact, there are many better ways you could pay for it. But if you try to raise revenue for transportation through other means, like, you know, through a different fee that is more cumbersome, more challenging for wealthy individuals and exempts low-income people, you're going to run up against a buzzsaw, just from a political standpoint. So we have a lot of work to do to change that perception, because when, you know, I was looking into this for 2008 when we did Measure R. The reason we went with a sales tax is we polled people, and people agreed that sales tax was the thing they could most live with if they had to pay for transportation through something. That's nice, and I guess if that's the only way we can pay for it, then that's better than not paying for it at all. But perhaps it is time for us to have a little bit of a reckoning about the fact that we are funding a lot of this stuff in a highly inequitable way to begin with. And that's why when we go to things like fairless transit, you know, and you say, well, perhaps we should get rid of fares on transit. You know, I can understand Hassan's board saying, well, we're already subsidizing this enough, but how much are we subsidizing everyone else? How much are we subsidizing everyone else who is enjoying the luxuries of driving alone for a price far less than what it costs all of us to provide that for them? So, you know, those are the way we think about some of these issues.
Sarah, just to the last point that Joshua made, if we really start charging drivers for the full cost of driving, I think people will think differently about fairless transit.
Well, it would be outrageous. It would be eye-opening.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Before we open up the discussion to the participants and answer their questions, I'd like to introduce Mike Hyland. He's my colleague in the Institute of Transportation Studies, and he's been integral in this NSF grant. So Mike, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks to all the speakers. So I'm going to give a bit of a preamble on the NSF grant, and then I'm going to ask a couple questions, but because all of our speakers actually responded so well to the prompts, they've actually answered most of the questions already, and it looks like we have a great list of questions in our chat, so I'll try to get it back to Sarah as quickly as possible. So the NSF grant is a planning grant, actually. It's called Addressing Unprecedented Community-Centered Transportation Infrastructure Needs and Policies. So it's a really great program, in my opinion, because it forces academics to partner with actual communities and leaders in that community. And for this, we're partnering with Sandag, but ultimately would like to extend it to all cities and regions across the country. The goal is really to develop the next generation of transportation planning models. And by next generation, we're thinking about two things mainly: bringing in mobility service providers, Uber and Lyft, and how their fleets are impacting transportation infrastructure and people that live in those cities, as well as trying to also optimize the policies and infrastructure investments using the models that already exist, but improving them through some advanced techniques. So I guess one other thing to mention here is ultimately we're trying to harness these transportation innovations and technologies in order to gain the societal benefits that they promise, while also avoiding the pitfalls that they also seem to have brought upon so far. So I'm going to go to my first question here. So we had a great list of what I would call social goals from the three speakers. Hassan mentioned fast, fair, clean transportation system. Joshua mentioned improving mobility and accessibility, as well as shifting away from single occupancy vehicles. And then Kome in his key performance indicators mentioned reducing VMT and emissions, as well as improving the user experience and productivity. So my first question is for all the speakers here: what do you see as the major obstacles to meeting those goals? And I think I'd like to hear about the obstacles that are for the most part out of your control. And then as a follow-up, how do you think technologies and transportation innovations can help address those obstacles?
Joshua, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, look, the main obstacle, I think, is the governance structure that we're dealing with. We're a county-wide organization with 8 in the county. 88 cities have different sets of regulations, land use patterns, opinions, probably 89 opinions. So it's it's a very challenging governance structure for that reason, and because we have a board that is composed entirely of elected officials who are not elected to the Metro Board. They are elected to do a job for their constituents, and then this is their side job to help run Metro. And so it creates kind of an inherent conflict of interest for them, because they have to satisfy their constituent needs in order to do their jobs. But their constituent needs sometimes might have to be subjugated for the greater need of the county, and that's difficult for them to do. So when we talk about things like trying to get more space set aside on a street for a bus lane, or trying to put in a new light rail line on surface streets. One of the things that our chief of program management has said, which I think is very apt for our situation, is he said, look, in all these projects, when we're trying to build this thing, we are the only people advocating for the project. Everyone else is advocating for something else that they want to, either they want to stop the project, they want to add something to the project, they want to take something away from the project. We're the only ones who are trying to push that boulder up the hill against all these other political entities and business entities. And that's a tough position to be in. So are we going to be able to achieve greater mobility and accessibility in that environment? It's going to be very, very hard. And that's why we've started to look at other options that are more realistic, besides just trying to build out the infrastructure, which we're still going to try to do, but it's going to take time and a whole lot of money.
So I'll just not much to add. I agree completely that governance and the complexity, even in a place like San Diego, it's a one county. And you would think, oh my God, one county, 18 cities, you should have an easy time convincing people about what's the right thing to do for the county. my gosh, was I surprised by how different that North Coastal with the South or the border issues. But I would go even, the challenges go a little bit beyond. And I don't want to be commie, because I was commie for a while, and it was really hard when you have 6 counties to do a plan for. And it's like, oh my God, it's a 6 different countries that are trying to find a common goal in a very difficult situation. But I think, and Joshua is right, I think we need to not always link building infrastructure as the only solution for our mobility in the future. I think we need to have a fixed guideways and fixed highways and all of that. But to utilize those to the fullest of its ability, we need to deploy policies and strategies that could be easier governed than not. When I was teaching at Cal State Northridge, I challenged the kids. I said, how do you get to a point where everybody wins? Is there such a thing that everybody wins? And they went and they came up with a great idea. And one of their ideas is give everybody everything they want, and at the end, ask them if they want it, they have to give up something. And I think that's true. If you, Joshua had 88 cities and 89 different opinions about how to do things. And therefore, sometimes if you ask the question differently, you might get a different answer. And finally, it's really hard to do things in a democracy. We're a great democracy. We're an example. If you're in China or in Russia and somebody felt that you need to do this, you do it and nobody will question. So in a democracy, you have to do extra work, extra outreach, like Sarah alluded to. Outreach is important, but also the kind of outreach you do is important. And like Comey said, you can't just limit your outreach to those who are politically going to support you, because eventually somebody's going to wake up and says, this is the reason you did it.
Yeah, I don't think I can add anything to what they said. I think governance is key. Trying to run an 86-member board to make a decision on something that affects everybody and they're all happy with it, I think it's almost impossible. So this particular question calls for heroes that would go against their political interest in some cases to make some of these things work. I think the best way we've seen to make things work is what I just presented, is where we act at the local level. Because one of the things that's really worked well for us in this region is to enable our cities to do things that will further the objectives that we're trying to preach. And when they get it right and they're celebrated for it, guess what? Other cities want to do the same thing. It's worked really well in our active transportation program, where we'll go out on Saturdays and show folks, go human, how that could work in their communities. I have never seen one event where people have told us don't ever come back. What tends to happen is people talk about the event we just had in, La Habra, and then folks in Glendora want the same. So we begin to see that collective action slowly build. It's a very tedious process. And again, that's the stuff of democracy, I guess.
Thank you very much. And I'll just ask one more question. And I guess also feel free to disagree with the premise of this question, but I would argue that the private sector has never been more integral in the delivery of mobility within cities and regions. I'm thinking particularly about Uber and Lyft, but also scooter, bike sharing companies, et cetera. So given that, how have you changed, and how do you plan to change in terms of meeting those goals we talked about earlier, while making sure that you're serving community interests rather than just benefiting these private sector mobility players?
And I'll start with this. And Uber and Lyft, it's a good example to use to answer your question, right? At one point, in the beginning, Uber and Lyft says, well, we solved the congestion problem by having Uber and Lyft, and to find out that every study that came after that says Uber and Lyft increases vehicle mile travel and increases congestion and increases pollution. And even if you do it in places like San Francisco and where they're popular, they're really they made downtown inaccessible. So the question is, how do you balance a world of competing interests? You know, you're trying to reduce emission of greenhouse gas, provide public goods by relieving congestion, at the same time going to private companies that are after profit. And this is a discussion, the answer is not there yet for it, I think. But Joshua, I think, answers some of that. You could actually take the Uber and Lyft model and you can make it work. And that's what they're doing at Metro. And I think that's what they try to do at SCAG through the Go Human campaign. How do I take a private industry idea that really works well when it comes to the goal of these companies and make it work as a public good? And that's a challenge for all of us, I think, moving forward to do.
Yeah, and I would have, since you invited me to do so, I will definitely disagree with the premise of your question. Because I would say the private sector had a much greater role when they were running the transit systems, for example, than they do now. And you know, that's how cities started, is with private transportation providers. And it didn't work then, and it won't work now. And the reason that it doesn't work is that a profit motive is actually not a good way to provide what is essentially a public good. When you use the profit motive to provide it, you wind up with market errors and externalities that always disproportionately punish those who are most vulnerable. I mean, it's just inevitable, right? And so that's what you saw to some extent with Uber and Lyft, right? You've got these systems that were really helpful to people who could afford them and people who had smartphones, that were causing more pollution and more congestion for the greater good, and were completely inaccessible to people with disabilities, for example. So, you know, that's why we've always looked at it as partnerships with the private sector are not only necessary, but they're the only way that the private sector can be an effective player in this space. That we have to bring the public policy goals that we care about to the private sector, because they will not get to them on their own.
And just to elaborate on the point, because public goods, you know, when people ask me, so what's in it for you? We're in the business providing public goods. And that's by itself not something that people agree on. If Uber and Lyft cared about public goods and make it accessible to handicapped people and accessible about how many miles they circle to get a ride, their business model will change completely. There will be no business model, period. And so therefore, I think Josh was right. If you go through history and those who tried to provide private transportation, they didn't really consider public goods part of their calculation, as profit is the motive. Now, I am totally agree with Joshua. The private sector has to come in. Both sectors have to work together. But you have to define from the get-go, is profit and public good something that could meet somewhere. And once you define that, you're going to be in good shape.
Well, I think I agree with both of you guys. Private sector is necessary, but to the extent that it furthers the public good. And so how you bring them in and how they get paid so they can continue to be sustained in the process, those are all up for conversation. But you have to tailor their services to further the accessibility and mobility needs that you're trying to serve. I think maybe one of the things that we probably don't spend too much time convincing ourselves on is the fact that providing mobility and accessibility to all is a public service. And so essentially the public pays for it. We don't see it on the highway side because it's so hidden. And so we assume that people are paying their way on the highway side. And because it's so much more external on the transit side, we all react to it more so. So I think understanding that to move people and be equitable in having folks have access to the opportunities within a community, we have to overtly make sure that we're serving those needs. And sometimes that means extending it using the Uber Lyft model. I think Go Monrovia is an example where they were able to geofence their city and sign up with Lyft to do some of that. that's an example. How sustained it can be over time, I think is part of the experiment that we're watching. And I know that it's been adversely affected by COVID-19. But I think when we talk about all of that, I don't, because I saw a question on the chat, I don't think we're saying people cannot drive their cars. What we're saying is it's okay to own a car, but you should have a choice as to whether you drive the car. And so there are communities, there are environments where you probably don't have a choice. You have to drive the car. We're suggesting that, at least I know my colleagues are joining me, we're suggesting that it should be a matter of public policy that we optimize mobility in a way that it serves environmental goals, social goals, and equity goals. So that's the point, is to be able to provide the choice. I think Metrolink is a good example. 80% of Metrolink riders own a car, but they've chosen to take Metrolink because it's a better alternative to their for their commute. So could we make such overt alternatives available on multiple levels as a society, such that people have that choice to either drive or not drive?
I have plenty of follow-ups, but I'm going to hand it back to Sarah so the audience can get some questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mike. We have a lot of questions, and some of them are part and parcel with other questions, so I'll try and combine them. If we don't get to all the questions, because I know I promised you we'd be done by 2:30, do you mind if I put them together and send them out to you and have you write a response, and we'll send them out to everybody when we do the post-survey?
Sure.
It's fine.
And we'll also, we can send the recording to all the participants today in that email with the post-survey and the response to the questions. So thank you. The first question, Hassan, please elaborate on the complete corridor and transit leap concepts, and how do these 5 components connect from a regional perspective?
That's a good question. So as I indicated earlier, we have about 12 corridors in San Diego County, the biggest being the I-5, which goes all the way through LA and beyond. So right now, as we speak, we have something called the North Coast Corridor project. And that project is double tracking the commuter rail line, building a segment of walkable and bikeable places, and adding a high occupancy toll lanes to the 5, a new one, and maybe combining it with an existing one to have a priced 2 hot lanes each direction on the 5. So you're providing commuter rail, you're providing highway option, you're providing active transport, but at the same time, you're doing it such that you're pricing it such that hopefully if the board goes with it, because every time you mention pricing to the board, they really want to fire you immediately. But if we go and price it right, and we provide these other choices, then like Colby said, we're not telling anybody not to drive. But if you want to drive, that's a choice, and it costs a certain amount of money. And if you want to take transit, that's a choice. It should in your mind cost some amount of money. But the complete corridor idea is you shouldn't have a corridor where 98% of the people have to choose the car if they decide to make a trip. And I'm totally okay with 10% having another, taking another choice. I mean, people misestimate that, but to me, transit is not gonna carry ever the majority of the people in our regions, ever. But if I could go from 2.5% to 10%, boy, I am doing a great deal of good for everyone. So a complete corridor is a multimodal approach, a choice approach that's priced right. We're doing that on the I-5, and we need to do it in the 11 other corridors. And I will tell you that Caltrans is getting just used to this concept of how to use the multimodal approach that keeps the car, which is going to be the case for the most preferred mode, but at least you bring in something different.
Thank you. Joshua, this is 3 or 4 questions combined. At least I'm trying to combine them. For the Metro Micro program, can you explain, is it more a taxi-like service, car sharing? And will it be subsidized for all or just a certain group of people? And what will the hours be?
Yeah, Metro Micro is not a taxi service. Think of it more as a shuttle type of van vehicle, right? So like bigger than a car, so bigger than a taxi, but smaller than a bus. And the service is operated by Metro employees. So it's not like a traditional private sector operation. It is a public sector operation. And so yes, it is subsidized, but it's subsidized in whole, not just for specific groups. I mean, we're offering it at $1 fare to start because we're launching it during the pandemic. We eventually expect to raise that fare, but it still will be much less expensive than even a shared ride in a Uber Pool or a Lyft line. What was the last question?
What are the hours?
Hours. Yeah, it's not going to be 24 hours a day. It'll be more typical transit hours. So from early morning commute till late evening, but it won't be a 24-hour service.
Thank you. Kami, before I ask you a question, I want to note that Jonathan from your staff has posted the link to the Future Communities Network. So if it's in the chat box, if anybody wants to get it, we'll also make sure.
Well, that's Jonathan. I would expect no less.
Thank you, Jonathan. What kind of thought is being put into the VMT reduction or relocation of medium and heavy duty relocation of medium and heavy duty vehicles like freight trucks in disadvantaged communities?
Well, there is a lot that's been sort of considered along those lines. Typically, that's on a project by project basis. You know, like a project going through a low income or impacting the community of color. But we're doing something more programmatic right now. We just signed on, and our board just approved a grant that we got to look at the last mile and first mile of light and heavy duty freight moves in our region. And so that work just started. And so that's going to give us a lot more tools and will give us some more consideration on what can be done to minimize the impact on, especially on communities of color. I think beyond that, there are other programs that are looking at rapid electrification. This is part of our long-range plan. Rapid electrification involves the idea that, and you begin to see it around the ports especially, where there are some low-hanging fruit where you can get some of the drayage trucks converted over. I think the issue still remains with the line haul trucks and the big trucks, whether or not you could convince those assets to turn over into 100% electric. And we're not just talking about electric as in plug-in. We're trying to be as technology agnostic as possible. I think hydrogen has a play in here, especially as you look at, we can't look past transit buses as well. There are some transit goals in our region that would look to move many of those transit buses also to electric, some hydrogen, some plug-in. So there is a lot of considerations going on. We're not quite yet seeing, the outcomes of that. We're seeing traces of potential success, indicators of success in the making, on several fronts at this time.
Fascinating to see where all the technology is headed. Speaking of which, Hassan, you got a lot of people's attention when you started talking about your 2-mile pilot of conductive charging. Do you know yet where that's going to be located? Do you know how much would be charged for it? And do you think it's a good way to reduce emissions? And might it also help promote people buying electric vehicles?
As you know, San Diego has a larger rate of electric vehicles share than any other county in the state, I think. one could say people in San Diego have more money. I don't know whether that's the case, but they have more electric vehicles for sure. The pilot that we're talking about is actually a sand diagram pilot that's going to be done in San Diego. I have negotiated a 2-mile segment in one of our tribes, Indian Nation tribes. They donated the roadway to do that. And we're in touch now with the French company, and that's gonna do that. The pilot right now is just that, a pilot. It's gonna cost about $12 to $15 million to run it, and then analyze it, wait for the results, and see whether it has a bigger application. We believe it does eventually. Look, the recent governor order is a good example. If you want to phase out the fossil fuel by 2035, you better start thinking about the infrastructure for that future fleet that we're going to have. And right now, frankly, we don't have much more infrastructure than the cars we have. Especially with these blackouts now. Imagine if you have electric cars, you have blackout and you start. But the question is, what does that do to driving, and that encourage driving or not? That's beside the point. But if we want to phase out fossil fuel, I think this pilot becomes very handy. Obviously, we have to wait for the results and the analysis of the pilot before applying it, but we're very hopeful.
Yeah. Joshua, although I think it can be answered by others too, because I think it's a very intriguing question. With the advent of new online stores and auto delivery systems, and everyone in the future, are there ideas to integrate passenger mobility and urban freight? If so, would it require redefining the organization structures of transit agencies?
Yeah, I mean, certainly those things are connected, and we've already integrated them to a degree. I mean, we have an entire freight group within Metro that works on these on freight planning issues. And as I mentioned earlier, we're currently using our mobility on demand service as a method of food delivery to vulnerable populations. So yes, there is an intersection. No, I don't think it requires the reorganization of Metro. There are a lot of other things that might require the reorganization of Metro. I wouldn't point to that as one of them. But I think the larger point you're getting at is an interesting question, right? Which is, we are now seeing way more of the traffic as a percentage on our roads is being accounted for by freight, because people are ordering so much stuff to be brought to them at home. And the question there is, given that that's the case, is it our job to accommodate that? Or is it our job to say, hey, maybe that isn't the life that we all want, to have everyone sitting at home ordering things? So I think that gets to the very heart of what public policy is all about, right? I guess I've always started with the belief of, let's decide what we want and then put together public policy that gets us to that, rather than saying, oh, well, this is what's happening, so let's react and accommodate it. And that's the philosophical perspective that I take.
And by the way, to add to what Joshua just said, this is exactly what's wrong with our transportation system today, is we always were reactionary to something. Oh, there is a congestion, let's add a lane. Now there's a freight because of COVID-19. People are bored sitting at home doing nothing but ordering stuff from the internet, and therefore these truck. I believe we need a public policy. And by the way, we shouldn't promote or design public policy just because we have COVID-19. This shall pass, and there will be another side. So it would be short-sighted for us now to say, well, this is specific to COVID-19, like COVID-19 is going to be with us forever. But a public policy regarding freight in general should be there. And I think Joshua is right. The SCAG and Metro and all other entities have a freight specific. Actually, they were in California, a freight specific funding a few years back. That was very significant, the first time of its kind. But I also want to remind people that when people want to promote highway expansion, they say, well, we're not talking about people movement, we're talking about freight movement. Give me a break. Now, you want a system that accommodates everything based on a good, sound public policy. And unless you have that good sound public policy for goods and people movement, you shouldn't start doing anything just simply because somebody want to advocate for something and you politically find it. It's politically easier to say, well, we need to add that capacity because of freight. It's like Joshua said, it's like this model of us sitting at home shopping is a good model and we should promote it moving forward. And last thing I would say, traffic in San Diego County went down to about 40% of what's pre-COVID, and now we're at 96%. Granted, there is no peak congestion, but traffic is back to where it was because there's all kinds of things that's happening with these people staying at home. And we have to be careful about doing anything without formulating a sound public policy around it.
Very well. But Tommy, just a quick response to not a quick question. It's worth a lot of thought. But telework, telehealth, and remote learning have proven effective at reducing congestion and greenhouse gas emissions. Are these strategies that your members and the transportation agencies you work with, are these strategies that they will encourage and promote? Can they materially help these organizations meet mobility goals? And are there strategies beyond all these organizations' jurisdictions too?
Well, I think the simple answer is yes. But before I get to that, I think on the last question about freight deliveries, this is a real thing, and that's why we're seeing a lot of activity on the curbside, and it's changing basically our urban form in some respects. We're adapting to it, and I think the majority of deliveries now are packages by the FedExes and the UPSs and so on. So we're seeing that it's a real phenomenon pre-COVID, and I think it will continue. And COVID may have maybe exacerbated it, and it will continue. So that's something to think about and figure out what's the best way to assure that there is minimal impact. There's less negative impact or mitigate the impacts as we move into that direction. In terms of, and I think this is related to in terms of the digital effect of the digital solution to commute, which is where we all started when we started talking about broadband, was how do we use broadband as a commute congestion aid, right? How do we reduce folks that are traveling by making sure more people are teleworking? That was always, a main staple of our strategies in transportation. And we were actually continuing to do that. And we were projecting that more people will work from home before COVID than had worked from home before, because we could see the continued capacity that folks now have to work at home in terms of broadband. But with COVID-19, we've now seen even more so that more people can work at home than maybe we had been led to believe. And so that's going to be a necessary part of the strategies going forward, not just for commute, but also for other activities like health and education. And so to the extent that more people are getting their education online, more people are getting using telehealth, we're going to see some more travel changes. Now, I think time will tell where that's going to rest. A lot of people think this is going to be a huge, drastic difference in commute as a result. We think it's going to be a lot higher than what we're projecting before, but we don't think it's going to be particularly mind-boggling high, basically. Hassan talked about we're now seeing VMTs come back to almost pre-COVID levels. But what's interesting about the VMT that's come back, it's different in terms of time of day. We're seeing more people that are working at home, running errands during the day than they would have if they had been at work downtown or at some precise location. And so that's adding to the VMT that we're seeing. And so, yes, VMT has come back, but it's not the commute, the directional commute VMTs that we used to see on the state highway system. We're seeing people actually working at home, take the meetings in the morning, run out during lunch or run out in the afternoon and do a number of errands, come back, complete work, and maybe work into the work later in the day to get their work done. And so we're seeing some of those shifts, and I think you're going to continue to see that VMT flux that we're in as a result of even working at home doesn't change the VMT per se. I think it's one of the evidence that's kind of coming out of this experience that we're seeing during COVID.
Yeah, I don't want to say goodbye to you. I think this has been fantastic. In fact, I think we should all come together again in a year, 2 years max. Technology is so disruptive, and you're working on such amazing projects right now. It would be so interesting to see where you are a year from now and just check in with you. And so we can talk about that, but that's my dream. And I just can't thank you enough. So thank you for taking the time. It's been a total pleasure. It's been thought-provoking and exciting. I also want to thank Mike Hyland and Steve Ritchie and all of ITS for helping put this on. If you guys have any parting comments or you just want to say goodbye, that's great.
Thank you.
Well, I should just mention that.
Sarah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Well,
I've got to go. Sorry, Rick. Oh,
yeah, I should just mention that the last mile study was posted on the chat, so if folks are looking for it.
Oh, good. Thank
Right,
you.
Jonathan. Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Joshua. Were you going to say something? Or you were...
No, I was just saying thank you. This has been great, and yeah, let's see where we are in a year. That'd be fun.
Josh, I'm looking forward to see your program gets evaluated, the macro transit program. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. All right.
Good
Thanks.
luck to all of you
Good
with
luck,
all
folks.
your initiatives.
Bye.